The following process is going to show you how to separate the foreground, midground, and background for a parallax scroller animation. What I'm going to go through now is the second part of what's going to be assignment 6. So this is what you have to do next. So after you have your long landscape, I want you to separate it into a foreground, a background, and a midground. Okay, foreground, midground, and background. So what you're going to have to do is like kind of look at your landscape and figure out what are the things that are in the foreground, what are the things that are in the midground and the background. So the sky is going to be your background. I would say your midground for this one would be like the trees and the buildings, and maybe in the foreground you have like these kind of strange little geometric objects. So maybe those are my layers. You decide what yours are, but you need to separate the three. You could, if you want, you can maybe have more layers than that. Maybe, for example, I have 2 background layers, like a far background with the sky, another background with like these islands, and maybe I have like 2 foreground layers, or maybe a couple midground layers. But we're gonna have to separate them. And so the idea is we're gonna create another series of masks to separate these things, and we might have to do more cloning and more painting. So here, in this example, and what you should do with yours too, is to take everything that you've done and group it. If you have a background layer that says background, also double click on that and just hit OK so it becomes a normal layer. But take everything that you've done and group it. You can hit Control or Command G, or just hit the little folder icon in your layers palette down here. So now you have everything in one group. And then what we can do is we can duplicate the group. So one group is going to be your foreground, one group would be your midground, and one would be your background. In this example, what I'll do is I'll start working on like the background first. So you can add a mask to the group itself. So now I have a mask on the group, and now I can go in here and I can kind of paint out everything but my background. And when you guys do this, what you're going to have to do after you mask it out is you're going to have to rebuild the parts that are missing. So for example, I'll start, and for masking out for this purpose, I'm just going to use a brush and just paint black in the mask. So as I paint, I'm painting out the trees. And like this mountain. And let's see. I'll keep the lake, so maybe the lake's part of my background. So I'm just doing like a quick masking job, getting rid of all the foreground and midground elements. So and remember, you have a mask, and you know the mask is the one that you're working on, because in the layers palette the mask has little white corners, and you're painting black into the mask, which is basically hiding those pixels on the layer that the mask corresponds with. So after I paint out the mask, I'm going to have to rebuild the background because when this scrolls, you don't want it. What's going to happen is the foreground and the background and the midground are all going to move at different rates. And the midground, the idea with parallax is that things that are in the foreground move faster than what's in the background. So if the midground is moving faster than the background, and there is any missing information behind the midground, well, that's going to look weird because it's going to show up as an empty spot. So what we have to do is, using a combination of painting and cloning and even our brush tools, is to recreate all the parts of the background that's kind of missing. And you don't have to do, it's not necessary maybe to do the bottom part because it's going to be covered, but sometimes just to make things easier, I do the whole thing. So to recreate this stuff, it's going to be a combination of painting and cloning. You can start with painting, let's say, and we want to create a new layer. So on top is a new layer, and this is where we're going to start kind of filling in information. And I'm just kind of looking at the colors that are there, and then making a selection of those colors. And the kind of, where those colors are, it's like I'm just painting those areas. So basically, I'm just filling in all the transparent pixels that exist now. So I'm just using the paintbrush, and then I use the eyedropper as I paint to capture a little bit of color on the edges that exist, or maybe where two different colors meet. So I'm always kind of sampling new colors and then painting. So it's a combination of painting and sampling. You're painting, sampling colors, and just looking at how the background extends and picking colors that extend from that background. So this is kind of like, and this is all done in a layer, because if I mess up or if I don't like it, I can just go into my layers and I can just turn it off. So I can.
Is the layer above the mask?
Yes, it's above. Yep. If I don't like it, I can just turn it off. See? I just try to, go fast, and I try to, where two colors meet, I try to use the eyedropper tool at that area where they meet. I also like to use lesser opacities too and build it up to get better blending. Now for some parts like this lake, what you can do is you can just make a selection over some things. Like this lake might extend farther. So instead of just cloning or painting it, what I usually do is I just grab certain elements, I make a selection, I copy it, I hit Control D to delete the selection, and then I paste it back in. And when you copy it, actually instead of using just a normal Control C for copy, what you can do is you can go into Edit and say Copy Merged. And what Copy Merged does, it actually copies all the layers that are within that selection, not just what's on that single layer, but it copies all the layers. Because I'm painting in a layer above and the lake's a layer below, but I may have some paint detail that I've already added from the layer above. So copy merge is going to be better for what I want, because when I paint that back now, I have that whole lake. I think maybe the lake kind of extends a little bit too. So now I have the lake. The lake started here, but now it extends a little bit further. And the other thing too, as you work, try to like build up your layers. If you paint all in one layer, it's hard to fix things. So maybe I paint a little bit in one layer, I add some elements, and then I create a new layer, and then I keep on painting. So I can, you know, if I need to use a mask, I can do that. Here I'm using a little bit of cloning to bring back some of that lake. Same way, maybe I can use do some more cloning of like clouds. Just cloning into more clouds and sky. And then one little trick to make things go faster is do a narrow selection. I do this a lot. I do like a very like narrow selection with the marquee tool. And then I create a new layer, and then I do a copy merged and deselect, and then I paste it, and then I transform, and then you can hit shift and just grab the bottom of it and kind of stretch it out like this, so it kind of takes all the colors and kind of like smears it like that. But it's like a quick way to fill up your background. And I can do it in both directions, so I can grab it here. And then once you have everything set, get into the habit of like grouping the layers. So I grouped all these paint layers here. So that's like, you know, before and after. And now that I have this as like my background, what I'll do is I'll duplicate my original layer group, and I'm duplicating the whole group. You can just drag that folder onto the piece of paper icon to group it. And then I'm going to delete the layer. Well, actually what I can do is I can invert the layer mask. So I'll hit Control I on the layer mask, and then bring it to the top. Or you can actually control click on the masks below, go to the top group, apply the mask, and then invert the mask with control I. So now I have 2 layers. I have like a foreground and a background. And then we can, what we'll do is, oops, and I have to go in here. Make sure all my masks are linked. But now this foreground element can move in relation to the background element. So you can get some movement. And then what I'll do with this one, I'll duplicate the midground. Well, let's say this is actually the midground, what I just did. I will grab that whole group, go into in layers, drag it onto the folder, duplicate it. So grab the right thing. Or the piece of paper icon, duplicate it. And then I'll paint maybe out, I'll mask everything out but this like purple lake and these little boxes, and maybe that's my foreground. So I can go back now, make sure I have black with my brush. And this part of this assignment is probably more challenging because now you're doing a lot more masking and grouping. And then when you're done with each one, just make sure you group them. So basically you should have at least 3 groups: background, foreground, and midground. And here for the midground too, I need to create a layer on top and just make sure I paint out the midground stuff, and then I'll combine that midground layer, and I'll just go ahead and rename them too. So now I got background, midground, and foreground. With this layering of different landscape sections, the foreground is always going to be the top layer, midground will be in the middle, and background will always be the bottom layer. Because the foreground kind of hides some of the midground, and the midground hides some of the background. But when we animate this, what's going to happen is the foreground and midground are going to move a little bit in relationship to one another to give us the illusion of a parallax movement. So that's what you can work on next. After you get all of your landscape elements stretched out in one long landscape, start to isolate foreground, midground, and background. And then when you start to isolate those different landscape features, then you're going to have to fill in the hole that's left behind. You know, there's going to be a hole left behind because you basically, because when you move, if you don't fill that in, you're going to have a weird kind of white gap or something in the animation. It looks weird.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So you have to mask it out first, like the mid level, mid round
Yeah, I mean, I would start with the background first,
background.
then the midground, and then the foreground.
Okay.
Make sure you use masks. You don't want to delete pixels. If you use a mask, you can always duplicate the layer again, and then just delete the mask, and then you have your original back that you can modify. Just remember that, you know, not to use the actual eraser tool to get rid of pixels. Always mask out the pixels, because if you use the eraser, then it's destructive, and if you need to go back to the beginning, you can't, because unless you have enough history. But you know, if you've been working on a project for a while and you deleted pixels instead of masking out pixels, you need to fix something, you can't do it because the process of using the eraser tool is destructive. So any other questions? This is going to be just part 2 of assignment 6, but we still have to do the animation part. So that's going to be another whole lecture on animating. But before we get into that, you create your long background, and then you separate foreground, midground, and background. And the key to doing the separations is to use groups. You can add masks to the groups, and then you can add layers on top to modify those different layers. So I have this set here as a video. And so there's basically going to be two videos. One about if you came in late, or if you just kind of missed something.